Viewer discretion is advised.
In the NFL, if you are a Lion, you need to eat playoff wins in order to not starve to death. And this poor kitty needs to be taken from Detroit by animal control. It's actually reminiscent of old car emblems, so I get it, but it looks like I could have drawn it in Adobe Illustrator in about 5 minutes.
Ah, Lions fans, the only source of joy for the past 50 years was watching your old QB win a Super Bowl like y'all won it. I can't wait until they raise the Matthew Stafford banner and hand everyone in the front office Matthew Stafford rings. Dan Campbell is likable, but y'all still suck. Remember, you started 0-11 last year, and the highlight of the season was Jared Goff's girlfriend finding out you won your first game. America's favorite holiday tradition is now watching the Lions lose on Thanksgiving. Oh, and I know how to piss you off. Sheila Ford Hamp. And of course, this field goal. What are the odds? Ford Field and Little Caesars Arena, Detroit, Michigan. Neither of these two stadiums individually break the bank, nor have an outrageous percentage of public funds used, at about 1/3 the cost each being made up by taxpayer dollars. However, the total bill combined, $574 million, is pretty staggering considering Detroit has been teetering on bankruptcy for years. And those funds could be used on, infrastructure or schools where a lot of the money was originally earmarked. I guess Detroit needs their sports teams, otherwise the place could get more depressing.
Detroit. Congrats, Lions fans. Your team employed both Barry Sanders and Calvin Johnson over the last 30 years and have just one playoff win to show for it. In fact, you have just one playoff win since 1957. You are irrelevant. Nobody's been afraid to play the Detroit Lions since Dwight Eisenhower was president. Your fans idolized Matthew Stafford like he was amazing and not a mediocre stat compiler who never won any big games. Seriously, Lions fans, what was the biggest win for you during Stafford's 12 years with you? A Week 3 game against New England in 2018? Sure. Stafford didn't have many good defenses or good run support, but he had very good receivers, and if he was truly as elite as Lions fans say he is, he would have won at least one playoff game. Even Tim fucking Tebow won a playoff game. Now that Stafford is gone, you're stuck with Jared Goff, who doesn't know how to wipe his ass without Sean McVay assisting him. Good luck. Rory, Lions. This is certainly a, let's say, different look for a Lion mascot. It's not bad, but the eyes are a little lifeless, which one would expect from the mascot of a team that has one playoff win over the last 64 years. Seriously, listen to that sentence again. I appreciate the 80s rocker hair and his cute little teeth, but sadly, I will have to deduct a few points for the tail, which looks like a massive turd. Rating, 6 out of 10. Detroit Lions, Bobby Lane. Matthew Stafford fans will be upset about this, but I had to go with Bobby Lane. Lane was known as a party animal who'd steal your girl. As for on the field, the thing that actually matters in this discussion, Lane was one of the best of his era. With the Lions, he made 4 Pro Bowls, 2 All-Pro teams, and won 2 titles as a starting quarterback. Although his playoff stat line of 1 touchdown and 12 interceptions is pretty horrific regardless of the era. In fact, ever since the Lions traded Lane early in the 1958 season, they've been a laughingstock of a team. Don't fuck with the blonde bomb. Detroit Lions, Mike McMahon. Ah yes, Mike McMahon. I remember this guy from my Eagles doomed 2005 season where he replaced an injured Donovan McNabb and started 7 extremely painful games. It turns out he was doing that for a few years in Detroit too. In 4 years with the Lions, he shifted back and forth between starter and backup for fellow shit quarterback Joey Harrington. He finished with 10 touchdowns and 13 interceptions for a 55 passer rating and a laughable 43.8% completion percentage. Detroit Lions 2014 wildcard round. Detroit rarely makes the playoffs, and when they do, they're never favored to win, so it was tough to find a game, but I managed to do it because I'm a fucking hero. In 2014 versus Dallas, they had a 13-point lead midway through the third quarter, but went scoreless on each of their last 4 drives, which includes the famous controversial defensive pass interference flag pickup on a Stafford throw to Brandon Pettigrew. Regardless, Detroit had many chances to put this game away and failed. Simply put, they chose. Detroit Lions, Michael Brockers. One might say Jared Goff, but I think most people realize that he sucks. Detroit doesn't have many highly thought of players, so I went with Brockers almost by default. He's never lived up to his first round billing, and he doesn't get sacks or many tackles for loss. I honestly don't know what he does well besides being durable. Detroit Lions, Matthew Stafford. Speaking of guys with rocket arms. To be fair to Stafford, Detroit really has had no other good quarterbacks in a long time, so he's the only one good enough to even be overrated in the first place. Remember, this video doesn't take into account a player's entire career, so even though Stafford's legacy has now changed forever after winning the Super Bowl in his first year in LA, it doesn't change the fact that he was mostly a high-volume, low-efficiency quarterback who didn't win anything in 12 seasons with the Lions. Detroit Lions, Frank Ragnow. I don't pretend to play close attention to offensive linemen, especially centers, but all the grades show Ragnow has been an elite center for several years, even though he was injured last year. And while it might not sound like much, that's enough to be the best player on this shitty team. Detroit Lions, Jared Goff. Jared Goof has never really been taken seriously. Even when he was making Pro Bowls and a Super Bowl appearance with the Rams, it was mostly, rightfully, credited to Sean McVay holding his hand. Now that he's on his own, he's back to stinking it up. Verdict? Properly rated. Detroit Lions. The new lovable losers. Dan Campbell is PC Principal come to life and seems like a cool guy. He's made the Lions easy to root for even if you're not a Lions fan. But here's the thing. We have absolutely zero evidence that the guy can fucking coach. In fact, when is the last time anybody has been afraid of the Lions? How can you possibly make a Lions fan mad since they're always awful? Oh, I know. Barry Sanders sucked in the playoffs and had a ton of negative yards trying to do too much. He wasn't blameless. He also quit on the team like a dog. Calvin Johnson was a great wide receiver, but he also quit like a dog. Some may blame that on the Lions' incompetence, but I say that both were mentally weak and not winners despite their outrageous talent. Matthew Stafford might have a ring now after joining a super team, but that doesn't change his Detroit tenure where he was a high-volume, low-efficiency quarterback who won 0 important games in 12 years. Stafford an elite QB who was simply stuck for years on a shitty franchise like Detroit? Or is he just a mediocre stat compiler like fellow first overall picks Drew Bledsoe and Vinny Testaverde? This video looks to find out ahead of his first season with the LA Rams. Enjoy. Stafford was drafted by an 0-16 team, so it's only fair that he got a pass for his extremely shitty rookie year in which he threw 13 touchdowns and 20 interceptions in just 10 starts, while the team finished 2-14. The high point was when he threw 5 touchdowns in a thrilling comeback win over the Brady Quinn-led Browns, which, I mean, is pretty much like beating a community college team, but still, let Lions fans have this one. Despite many terrible outings and injuries, Stafford's potential, keyword there, gave Lions fans hope for the future, as did the thought of him and budding superstar wide receiver Calvin Johnson destroying defenses together for the next decade. That hope would have to be put on hold for another year, though, as Stafford missed 13 games in 2010 due to various shoulder problems. The Lions were slowly but surely improving even without Stafford, as they finished 2010 with a 6-10 record. With Stafford, Megatron, and now NFL Defensive Rookie of the Year and All-Pro Ndamukong Suh, the Lions had a nice little nucleus forming. Stafford just needed to stay healthy. 2011 would officially be Stafford's breakout year, and the Lions' win-loss record improved drastically to 10-6 and a playoff spot. At just 23 years old, Stafford exploded for over 5,000 yards and 41 touchdowns while leading a top 6 offense. However, the Lions were just 1-5 against playoff teams, and Stafford was mostly disappointing in the fourth quarter of most of those losses with a chance to win or tie. Against San Francisco, Stafford threw an early fourth quarter touchdown to take a lead, but got nowhere on 2 drives afterwards with a 19-15 lead. San Francisco scored a go-ahead touchdown with a minute 51 left to go up 3, but Detroit went 3 and out in response. San Francisco added another field goal to go up 25-19, giving Detroit one last drive to respond, but nothing happened. Against Atlanta, Detroit had the ball early in the fourth, down by 4, but went 3 and out. Atlanta added a field goal to go up 23-16, and Stafford had 2 more drives to try and tie the game, but he failed to do so each time. Against New Orleans, Detroit had the ball down 7 early in the fourth, but the drive ended with a missed 55-yard field goal. New Orleans would add another touchdown to end the game at 31-17. Against Green Bay, in a mostly meaningless Week 17 game, Detroit's offense was fantastic, putting up 41 points, including Stafford throwing a touchdown with 2:39 left to go up by 3. However, Detroit's defense allowed Green Bay backup quarterback Matt Flynn to throw his 6th and final touchdown on the next drive to go up 45-41. Stafford threw an interception on the final drive, but you can't really blame him for this loss. In the playoffs, the Lions would once again meet up with the high-powered Saints offense on the road. Stafford and the Lions would put up a good fight, even cutting the score to 24-21 heading into the fourth, but the Saints just had too much firepower, gaining almost 630 yards of offense in a 45-28 win. Stafford had 2 fourth-quarter interceptions, but for the most part played well and doesn't deserve blame claim here. Nobody would know it at the time, but this would end up being his best individual season in a Lions uniform. Heading into 2012, there were actual expectations in Detroit for the first time since Barry Sanders. Stafford was even seen as a potential MVP candidate. Calvin Johnson would go on to have a legendary season, breaking the record for most receiving yards, and that's about where the positives end. Stafford threw an NFL record 727 passes, but only 20 of them went for touchdowns, and his efficiency took a major step back. Detroit's offense was mediocre and the defense was bad. After starting 4-4, the team imploded, dropping its last 8 games to finish a putrid 4-12. There were many close losses though. Against Tennessee, there was a giant what the fuck fourth quarter. Stafford threw a touchdown to go up 7 with 7 minutes left. Tennessee then scored 21 unanswered points in the next 5 minutes to go up 14. Stafford got hurt. Backup quarterback Sean Hill came in and threw 2 touchdowns in the last 2 minutes, including a Hail Mary as time expired to send it into overtime at 41. Tennessee added a field goal to go up 3, while Detroit's drive stalled out at the Tennessee 7-yard line to lose. Against Minnesota, Detroit got the ball down 7 with 1:42 left, but the drive stalled out around midfield as Stafford was sacked on the final play. Against Green Bay, Detroit had a 6-point lead with 2 minutes left when Aaron Rodgers threw a touchdown to take a 1-point lead with 1:55 left. Detroit went 4-and-out on the next drive to effectively end the game in a 24-20 loss. Against Houston, Detroit took a 31-24 lead on a touchdown run with 13:31 left. Detroit then had 2 drives up 7 but failed to score any points. Houston tied the game at 31 with 2 minutes left, and Detroit failed to score on its final fourth quarter drive and its 3 overtime possessions, including a missed 47-yard potential game-winning field goal. Houston would then go on to kick the game-winning field goal with 2:25 left in overtime to win by 3. Against Indianapolis, Detroit had a 12-point lead and the ball with 4 minutes left but punted away. Indianapolis would score 2 touchdowns in the final 4 minutes, including a 14-yard touchdown on the final play to win 35-33. Against Green Bay, Detroit had the ball at the Packers' 33-yard line to start the fourth, but tried a 51-yard field goal which missed. Green Bay added a touchdown to go up by 7. Detroit had 1 drive to answer but failed to do so. Green Bay added another field goal to go up 10 and eventually win by 7. Against Chicago, Detroit had the ball down 2 with 4:37 left but went 3-and-out. They never got the ball again and lost 26-24. 2013 wouldn't be as bad as 2012 for Detroit, but it would still end with a disappointing 7-9 record. Stafford's efficiency jumped back up slightly from the year before, but was still far behind his 2011 season. Overall, the 2013 Lions were a painfully average team, 15th in points per drive and 15th in points allowed per drive. Once again, though, there were many painfully close losses. Versus Arizona, Detroit had a 5-point lead entering the fourth, but failed to score any points on its 3 fourth-quarter drives, while Arizona added a field goal and a touchdown to win by 4. Versus Cincinnati, Detroit tied the game at 24 with 12 minutes left on a 50-yard Stafford touchdown to Megatron, but would fail to score on both of its next 2 drives with the game tied. Cincinnati would win by 3 on a game-winning 54-yard field goal as time expired. Versus Pittsburgh, Detroit had a 4-point lead entering the fourth, but turned it over on downs inside the Pittsburgh 10-yard line. Pittsburgh then went on a 97-yard touchdown drive to go up by 3. Stafford would throw an interception, and Pittsburgh added another touchdown off of it to pull away with a 37-27 win. Versus Tampa, Detroit had a 4-point lead entering the final stanza, but Tampa took a 3-point lead on an 85-yard touchdown pass early on. Detroit would fail to score any points on its 3 fourth-quarter drives as they ended in a blocked punt, a wide receiver fumble, and a Stafford interception inside the Tampa Bay 30 with a minute left. Versus Philadelphia in the infamous snow game, Detroit had a 6-point fourth-quarter lead after a kickoff return touchdown. Detroit would then score 0 points on its 3 fourth-quarter drives, while Philadelphia scored 21 unanswered points to win by 14. Versus Baltimore, Detroit took a 1-point lead with 2:21 left on a Stafford touchdown pass. Baltimore would respond by kicking a game-winning 61-yard field goal to take a 2-point lead with 43 seconds left. Stafford would throw an interception 2 plays later to end the game. Versus the Giants, Detroit had a 7-point lead with 5 minutes left when Stafford threw a brutal pick 6 to tie the game at 20. Detroit would fail to score again on any of its next 3 drives, as the Giants won when infamous woman respecter Josh Brown kicked the game-winning field goal in overtime. Versus Minnesota, Detroit had a 6-point lead with 13 minutes left after a negative 6-yard field goal drive. Yes, you heard that correctly. But Minnesota responded with a touchdown to take a 1-point lead with 9 minutes left. Detroit would fail to score on its last 2 drives and lost. 2014 would end up being the most successful season for the Lions in the Stafford era, as they finished 11-5 and were even in position to earn a first-round bye with a win in the final week of the season. Their defense was elite, finishing 4th in points allowed per drive, and although Stafford would make the only Pro Bowl selection of his career, the Lions' offense was once again mediocre, finishing 18th in points per drive. Stafford led the league with 5 game-winning drives and 5 fourth-quarter comebacks, but as always with him, none were against teams with a winning record. 3 particular regular season losses stand out. Versus Buffalo, Detroit had an 8-point lead heading into the fourth, but gave up a touchdown touchdown and 2-point conversion with 9 minutes left. Detroit missed 3 field goals in the second half, including a potential go-ahead 50-yarder with 26 seconds left. Buffalo would capitalize on the miss by hitting a game-winning 58-yard field goal as time expired to win by 3. Versus Arizona, led by backup quarterback Drew Stanton, the Cardinals jumped out to a 14-point first-quarter lead over Detroit, but the Detroit defense held them scoreless over the final 3 quarters. Unfortunately, the Detroit offense could only muster 6 points all game and lost 14-6. Versus Green Bay with a first-round bye on the line, Detroit had the ball down 7 early in the fourth, but Stafford fumbled. Green Bay would go on to score 9 straight points to put the game out of reach before Stafford added a meaningless touchdown to close out the scoring in a 30-20 Green Bay win. Detroit would have to play the 12-4 Dallas Cowboys on the road in the wild card round, and early on they looked crisp, jumping out to a 14-0 lead after 1. Detroit even had a 20-7 lead late in the third quarter and took a 6-point lead heading into the fourth when controversy ensued. Dallas added another field goal to make it 20-17 Detroit with 12:21 left. Detroit then pushed the ball to midfield when on third down, Stafford threw deep to tight end Brandon Pettigrew. In what appeared to be an obvious defensive pass interference penalty, the flag was thrown and then mysteriously picked up. What should have been a Detroit first down ended up resulting in a punt. Dallas would then go on a 6-minute touchdown drive to take a 4-point lead with 2:39 left. Stafford would actually fumble on the second play of his first drive getting the ball back and lose the ball to Dallas defensive end DeMarcus Lawrence, but Lawrence himself fumbled the ball back to Detroit, giving them extra life. Stafford drove Detroit to around midfield before he had a sack fumble on fourth down once again by Lawrence, who would not lose the ball a second time as Dallas ended Detroit's season in a 24-20 loss. Overall, Stafford was once again solid in defeat with 323 yards and a touchdown pass, but he also threw an interception and failed to move the ball in the second half. Detroit fans have a legit gripe about the non-DPI call, but even if that call stood, there's no guarantee Detroit scores a touchdown to go up by 10 there. We will never know what would have happened, but Stafford's history in tight moments against good teams is not very impressive, so I have my doubts. 2015 saw the Lions get off to a terrible 1-7 start, and although they would rally in the second half of the season to finish 7-9, they still missed the playoffs. Stafford was extremely mediocre in the first half of the season with just 13 touchdowns and 11 interceptions. However, after a midseason change at offensive coordinator, Stafford exploded, throwing 19 touchdowns to just 2 interceptions over the last games, which unsurprisingly correlated with Detroit going 6-2. This would also be Calvin Johnson's last year, which shocked everybody. And it wouldn't be a Stafford Lions team without some missed chances. Versus San Diego, Detroit had the ball down 5 with 11:53 left, but the drive stalled out at San Diego's 41, forcing a punt. San Diego had a touchdown to go up by 12 with 2:37 left and hung on to win by 5. Versus Denver, Detroit had 2 drives down 2 in the fourth quarter, which ended in a punt and Stafford fumble. Denver then added a field goal to go up by 5 with 8 minutes left. Stafford then threw an interception with 3:44 left, which Denver capitalized on with a touchdown to go up by 12 to clinch the game. Versus Seattle, Detroit was down 3 with 6:23 left. Stafford actually drove the team downfield. Then on 3rd and 1 from Seattle's 11 with just under 2 minutes left, Stafford completed a 10-yard pass to Calvin Johnson, who was stripped by Cam Chancellor at the 1. The ball flew out of the end zone for a turnover, and Detroit lost a heartbreaker by 3. Versus Green Bay, the infamous Aaron Rodgers Hail Mary game. Detroit had a 9-point lead with 7 minutes left. Rodgers ran for a touchdown to make it a 2-point game with 3 minutes left. Then after Detroit drained clock, Green Bay got the ball back at their own 21 with 23 seconds left and no timeout. A few plays later, after a face mask flag gave Green Bay another chance, Rodgers threw up a 61-yard touchdown bomb as time expired for the Green Bay win. Versus St. Louis, Detroit had the ball down 7 with 2 minutes left, but on 4th down near midfield, Stafford fumbled to clinch the 7-point loss. 2016 would see Stafford set the all-time single-season record for game-winning drives and fourth-quarter comebacks with 8. Unfortunately for Detroit, they would only win 9 games overall. The team would start 9-4 and was in great position to win the NFC North, but they dropped their last 3 games. Stafford, for his part, had a solid season with over 4,300 yards and 24 touchdowns. He also led the team to its 3rd and final playoff appearance in his tenure. Once again, however, there were plenty of missed chances to be better. Versus Tennessee, Detroit had a 12-point lead entering the 4th. Tennessee scored a touchdown on the first play of the quarter to cut it to 15-10. Detroit had 2 drives with a 15-10 lead, but both ended in punts. Tennessee took a 1-point lead with 1:19 left, but missed the 2-point conversion. Stafford drove the ball to the Detroit 45, but threw an interception with 28 seconds left to clinch the loss. Versus Houston, Detroit had the ball down by 7 early in the 4th, but did nothing with it and punted away. Houston would kick a field goal to go up 20-10 on the next drive. Detroit added a field goal to make it 20-13, but Houston then ran out the clock. Versus the Giants, Detroit had the ball down 4 in the 4th quarter, but once again did nothing with it, ending in a punt. New York added a touchdown on the next drive to make the final score 17-6. In the playoffs, Detroit would have to go on the road to play Seattle, and although the final score was 26-6, the game was actually surprisingly close most of the way. Seattle kicked a field goal to take a 13-6 lead early in the 4th, Stafford had his chance to respond and possibly tie the game, but went 3 and out. Seattle would then score a touchdown on each of its last 2 drives to close out the scoring. Stafford was a large reason Detroit was even in the playoffs, but once again he couldn't deliver in a big moment against a good opponent. 2017 would once again see Detroit finish with a 9-7 record, although this time they wouldn't be lucky enough to make the playoffs. Stafford, for his part, had one of his best seasons, throwing for 29 touchdowns with an impressive 99.3 rating. The Lions' offense finished 11th in points per drive, not great but not bad. Detroit's defense was decidedly average, finishing 16th in points allowed per drive. It should be noted that Detroit benefited from getting to play Brett Hundley in place of an injured Aaron Rodgers for 2 of their wins, and once again there were several close losses against good opponents that could have resulted in a better record. Versus Atlanta, the score was tied at 23 entering the 4th. Atlanta scored a touchdown to take a 7-point lead on the very first play. Detroit answered with a field goal to cut it to 4. Then Detroit would have 3 more drives down 4 with a chance to win. The first 2 were 3 and outs, but the final would end in controversy. Stafford drove the team 88 yards to the Atlanta 1-yard line with 19 seconds left. He threw 2 incompletions and then on 3rd down completed what appeared to be a touchdown to Golden Tate. It turned out to be short of the goal line upon review and resulted in a 10-second runoff since Detroit had no more timeouts, clinching the loss. Brutal. Versus New Orleans, in what was an extremely wild game, Detroit was down 45-10 midway through the 3rd quarter after a Stafford pick 6. Detroit then somehow reeled off 28 straight points to make it a 7-point game with 6:41 left. Detroit miraculously had the ball down 7 with a chance to tie, but Stafford threw an interception in the end zone for a New Orleans pick 6 to end the scoring at 52-38 New Orleans. Versus Pittsburgh, another game Detroit tricked away. Down 8 to start the 4th, Detroit settled for a 19-yard field goal to cut it to 5. They then got 2 drives down 5 the rest of the way. The first ended on a Golden Tate fumble on a 34-yard catch. The second ended after Stafford drove Detroit to the Pittsburgh 8-yard line before turning it over on downs. Pittsburgh then ran out the clock. Versus Minnesota, Detroit had the ball down 4 with 8:28 left but punted it away. They got the ball down 7 with 3:42 left, but Stafford threw an interception on 4th down and Minnesota ran out the rest of the clock. Versus Cincinnati, Stafford led Detroit on a go-ahead touchdown drive to take a 1-point lead with 9:54 left, but Cincinnati responded with a field goal to take a 2-point lead with 5 minutes left. Detroit did nothing on their next drive and punted it away. Cincinnati would add another touchdown to clinch the 26-17 win. After 4 seasons of mostly respectable play and 2 playoff appearances, Detroit fired Jim Caldwell and replaced him with wannabe Belichick disciple Matt Patricia. Although the season started out well enough with a 3-3 record after 6 games, including a 26-10 win over the eventual Super Bowl champion Patriots, the bottom fell out as Detroit finished just 6-10. Stafford's play reflected this. He started off well with 12 touchdowns and a 98.8 rating through 6 games, before throwing just 9 touchdowns over the last 10 games for an 84.4 rating. As always, there were many games up for grabs that Detroit failed to close out. Versus San Francisco, down by 3 with 1:08 left, Stafford drove Detroit to its 39-yard line before stalling out and turning it over on downs. Versus Dallas, Stafford threw a go-ahead touchdown with 2:17 left to take a 24-23 lead, but Dallas responded with a game-winning field goal as time expired to win by 2. Versus Chicago, with the score tied at 16 with 6 minutes left, Stafford threw a pick 6 to put Detroit in a 23-16 hole. He got the ball back and drove Detroit to the Chicago 11-yard line before throwing another interception to lose the game. Versus the LA Rams, Detroit had 2 drives down 3 in the 4th. The first ended with the punt, the second ended with Stafford fumbling. LA would then outscore Detroit 14-3 the rest of the way to win 30-16. Versus Buffalo, Buffalo took a 1-point lead with 10:26 left on a Josh Allen touchdown pass. Stafford responded by getting Detroit into field goal range, but they missed a go-ahead 48-yard 6 minutes left. Detroit would get the ball back again, but went 3 and out. Then Buffalo ran out the clock to secure the 14-13 win. The good news for Stafford fans is that 2019 would be the most efficient season of his career. The bad news is that he only played 8 games due to back issues. As a result of his injuries, Detroit completely combusted, going 0-8 without him to finish the season 3-12-1. But fear not, even in Stafford's 8 games, there were still some winnable games that slipped away. Versus Arizona, Detroit had an 18-point lead early in the 4th, but Arizona rallied for 18 straight points to send the game into overtime. In overtime, the teams exchanged field goals to make it 27-all, and nobody would score again as the game ended in a tie. Versus Kansas City, Stafford threw a go-ahead touchdown to make it 30-27 with 2:26 left, but that motherfucker Patrick Mahomes led KC on a game-winning touchdown drive to take a 4-point lead with 20 seconds left to essentially clinch the game. Versus Green Bay, Detroit had a 9-point lead in the 4th before Green Bay added a touchdown to make it 22-20 with 9 minutes left. Detroit punted it away, and Green Bay would drain the remaining 6:46 of clock and kick a game-winning field goal as time expired to win 23-22. It should be noted that Green Bay was helped by a questionable hands to the face penalty on 3rd down with 1:45 left to extend the drive, so Detroit had no chance to respond. Oh well, sucks to suck. Versus Oakland, in what would be his last game of the season, Stafford threw a touchdown to tie the game at 24 with 5:16 left. Oakland responded with a touchdown to make it 31-24 with 2:04 left. On Detroit's final drive, they got it down to the Oakland 1-yard line, but Stafford threw an incompletion on 4th down to lose the game. 2020 would be Stafford's last season in a Lions uniform, but unfortunately for Lions fans, the season played out like all of his other ones. Detroit had the worst defense in the league, leading to Matt Patricia being fired after 11 games, and overall finishing with a 5-11 record. Stafford once again had above average, if not spectacular numbers, 4,100 yards and 26 touchdowns for a 96.3 rating. However, unlike most years, there weren't many games Detroit lost that were really winnable, as only 2 times in 11 losses did Stafford even have the ball in the 4th quarter trailing by 1 score. Ironically, those 2 games were the first and last game of the season. Versus Chicago, Detroit had a 17-point lead entering the 4th before Mitch Trubisky, yes, Mitch Trubisky, threw 3 4-quarter touchdowns, including the go-ahead touchdown with 1:54 left. Stafford would drive Detroit to the Chicago 16-yard line, where on the final play he threw a great pass to wide receiver Marvin Jones for the game-winning touchdown, just for Jones to drop it and secure the Detroit loss. Versus Minnesota, in what would be Stafford's last game in a Lions uniform, he led a touchdown to cut the Minnesota lead to 37-35 with 4:26 left. However, the 2-point conversion would not be successful. Minnesota got the ball back and ran out the clock to put an end to Stafford's time in the Motor City. So now that I've reviewed Stafford's career in depth, it's time to answer the question: is he an elite quarterback who just happened to be stuck in terrible situations, or is he nothing more than an overrated stat compiler? To me, it's more of the latter. Stafford is nothing more than a solid NFL quarterback with a rocket arm. As I alluded to earlier, the fact that he's a former 1st overall pick with amazing arm talent and measurables will always tease people into thinking he can be better than he actually is. Everything about Stafford's career screams mediocre. In his 9 full seasons not interrupted by injury, his offenses have finished 14th in points per drive and 12th in yards per drive on average. His defenses have finished 20th in points allowed per drive and 17th in yards allowed per drive, which obviously isn't good, but it's not worse than what truly elite quarterbacks like Rodgers, Peyton, and Breeze had to deal with and succeeded with throughout their careers. Detroit never had much of a run game for Stafford, as they finished 31st in yards per carry across 2009 to 2020. But again, an elite quarterback is supposed to be able to cover up these types of warts. Nobody is saying Stafford should have won a Super Bowl with Detroit, but not even one playoff win? Come on now. Even Tim Tebow and Brock Osweiler did that shit. The most damning argument against Stafford is his disgraceful track record against playoff caliber opponents. Against non-playoff teams in his career, Stafford has a good 94.1 rating, 6.69 adjusted net yards per attempt, and a 64-31-1 record, a 67.5 winning percentage. However, against playoff teams, he has just an 84.4 rating, 5.83 adjusted net yards per attempt, and a historically awful 10-59 record, just a 14.5% winning percentage. Sure, it's expected for a quarterback to play worst against better competition, but what makes a quarterback elite is the ability to play well against quality competition on a consistent basis, and we have a large enough sample size now to know that Stafford rarely does that. And before you rush to quote his high number of career game-winning drives, that's a bit of a facade as well. Stafford has 39 career game-winning drives, but only 3 of them came against playoff teams, and only 2 of them came against winning teams. In fact, if you add up the records of the teams Stafford had game-winning drives against, they won just 38% of their games. And even if you remove their losses to Stafford, those teams still combined to win just 40.5% of their games. In a way, Stafford is the barometer for how good your team is. If you beat him, you're probably good. If you lose to him, you almost certainly suck ass. Who knows, maybe he'll find a second life in LA with McVay in a similar vein to Carson Palmer in Arizona under Bruce Arians. I have my doubts though.
Up every day, man. When someone tries to remind me, like, Dan, you ran out of the end zone. Guys, I'm completely aware of that. Like, I was there.
Oh, and 16. The early retirements of 2 Hall of Famers. A franchise quarterback wasted. Countless busts. 30 years without a playoff victory. In the broadest of strokes, this describes the plight of the NFL's Detroit Lions, a team that has never advanced to the Super Bowl. Hell, not even close. After a modest run of success in the early 2010s, the Lions are once again sitting at the bottom of the NFL standings. But today, we ask a tough question. Why
are the Detroit Lions so bad? It's hard to pinpoint just where the Lions hit rock bottom. To be fair, it feels like they hit rock bottom just about every week that they're not tying with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Seriously, how do you tie? But to lose at home to Andy Dalton and the Bears on Thanksgiving, that's a special low. That's more pathetic than heartbreaking. It stings in a different way than when Justin Tucker bounced a 66-yard field goal off the crossbar as time expired. That was pretty bad too. Unfortunately, there are a number of rock bottoms for Lions fans, starting with the premature retirement of Barry Sanders, which Sanders himself attributed to the losing culture within the franchise. Matt Millen took over as GM of the Lions, leading the team to a 31-84 record during his tenure, and spending premium first-round picks on wide receivers like Mike Williams, Charles Rogers, and doomed quarterback Joey Harrington. If a Lions fan is actually watching this video, they probably clicked off when I mentioned Matt Millen. Sanders' early exit was mirrored by the self-imposed exodus of Hall of Fame receiver Calvin Johnson, who retired prior to the 2016 season, blaming lingering injury issues, but also butting heads with Lions ownership, the Fords. Let's talk about them. The Lions have been owned by the Ford family since 1961, when William Clay Ford actually built a winning team. Ford became sole owner of the squad on November 22, 1963, the same day John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Since then, the team has been passed to Martha Firestone Ford and recently to her daughter, Sheila Ford Hamp. As stated before, the Lions sparred with their Hall of Fame wide receiver Calvin Johnson, who failed to mention the organization in his Gold Jacket speech in August 2021. Cold-blooded. Johnson and Sanders serve as a stark reminder to Lions fans that their failure is not temporary, but perpetual. Ultimately, it's hard to choose where the Lions have hit rock bottom. That's like trying to find a needle in a stack of needles. The Millen era, Dan Orlovsky scrambling through the back of the end zone in 2008, or perhaps even a Stafford era playoff loss to show that even when times are good, the team is snake-bitten. Instead, we'll settle with Thanksgiving 2021, when the Lions, in all of their shame, were on display for millions of festive onlookers. Every year, the president pardons a turkey. Lions fans don't get the same forgiveness from the football gods. The product they put out against the comparably disgusting Bears probably ruined appetites all across the nation. And when the field goal sailed through the uprights like a dagger in the heart of the Detroit faithful, it was a reminder that this team is not worthy of one of the longest standing traditions in American life. How did we get here? There was a brief point in time where the Lions were decidedly not bad in the first half of the 2010s. They were so not bad that one might even go as far as to call them good. Not great, but good. It was a coach by the name of Jim Schwartz that had rescued the Lions from the humiliation of their 0-16 season in 2008, taking over for Rod Marinelli and riding the ship, guiding the team to the playoffs in 2011, where they would lose to the Saints in the wild card round. But symbolically, it was like reaching Mount Everest after falling to the depths of football hell. Schwartz and his poor clock management were not the long-term solution, but it seemed that his successor might be. In 2014, the Lions hired Jim Caldwell, who 5 years earlier had led the Colts to Super Bowl 44, falling short in the final minutes. Caldwell, seen mostly as a product of Peyton Manning, was not the most inspiring choice, but proved he was a stabilizing force that the Lions desperately needed. In Caldwell's first year, the Lions fielded perhaps the best team Detroit had seen since the early 90s. The 2014 Lions went 11-5, allowing just 17.6 points per game and coming within a game of the NFC North title. In the wild card round against the Cowboys, the Lions took an early lead, but were shafted in the late going after a flag for pass interference was mysteriously picked up. Still, Matt Stafford and the Lions had a chance at the end, and in typical Lions fashion, failed to deliver. A rare, promising season up in smoke. In Caldwell's next 3 years, the team finished 7-9, 9-7, and 9-7. Making the playoffs one more time in 2016, but losing feebly to the Seahawks in the wild card round. Caldwell was ousted in 2017 after back-to-back seasons with a winning record. Lions GM Bob Quinn explained that 9-7 wasn't good enough.
What did you say?
Take a poll of most Lions fans right now, and I'm sure they'd do some heinous things for 9-7. Like watch John Carter in its entirety. Whether or not it was right to fire Caldwell, there's still no arguing that the Lions erred in the search for his replacement. Caldwell's departure made way for Patriots defensive coordinator Matt Patricia, famous for a pencil in his ear and for pissing off his players. Isn't the play sheet laminated though? I mean, why the did he need a pencil? If 9-7 wasn't good enough, what was 14-33-1 over the next 3 seasons? Patricia was an abject failure, and when he bit the dust, the pendulum swung to the fiery, beloved, but so far unworthy head coach Dan Campbell, whose monologue about biting kneecaps was immediately followed by a winless start to the 2021 season. Memories of 2008 have been evoked. New lows are reached every week, and there isn't even a top quarterback prospect serving as the light at the end of the tunnel. Jim Caldwell may not have pushed the Lions to greatness, but there's little doubt that this video would not exist had he remained the head man in the Motor City. He was a steady hand for an unstable mess of a franchise, and the Lions lacked the self-awareness to know they weren't a new head coach away from competing for a Lombardi. Caldwell wasn't holding them back. He was holding down the fort. The Lions hit on their first pick after going 0-16, Georgia's Matthew Stafford, but their subsequent record in the draft has been a bit spotty. After hitting on a QB, the Lions spent premium draft capital on players like Javid Best, Titus Young, Ryan Broyles, Eric Ebron aka Droptimus Prime, Amir Abdullah, Teez Tabor, Kerryon Johnson, and most recently Jeff Okudah, who has potential but is already hampered with injuries. It's not to say that the Lions haven't hit on some first-round picks. They have, almost all on the defensive side of the ball. And Ndamukong Suh, Nick Fairley, and Darius Slay were all big reasons the Lions went 11-5 in 2014. None of them are Lions anymore. But the Lions failed to maximize Stafford by surrounding him with playmakers in the post-Calvin Johnson era. I mean, Golden Tate isn't exactly who you want as your number 1 receiver. So it was no surprise that Stafford himself would eventually have to move on to greener pastures. And the Lions did right by him, sending him to a team that was hell-bent on competing, and competing now. Whether Stafford is a different guy or just a lion in Rams clothing, the jury is still out on that. The used car they got in return for him, well, that's another segment. So how do the Lions plug the holes in this sinking ship? It starts with Dan Campbell. However, there's little doubt it's time to part ways with offensive coordinator Anthony Lynn, who's calling plays for what's currently the 29th scoring offense in the league. Second, they must capitalize on the haul they got in the Matt Stafford deal, which was Jared Goff, 2 first-round picks and a 3rd-round pick. Not freaking bad, honestly. When you're the worst team in the league, taking the BPA, best player available, and talent, regardless of position, is crucial. As for Jared Goff, he's done all you could have hoped for, securing at least a top 3 pick next year. Yep, all that beating Goff may actually pay off, Lions fans. And what about that top pick? One of the most coveted assets in all of football provides a lot of options. They could reach on a quarterback, someone like Matt Corral. This is a Matt, not a Matthew, by the way. Or they could go with an in-state hero, Michigan pass rusher Aiden Hutchinson. Honestly, the best option for a directionless team is to trade down and acquire a few more rolls of the proverbial dice. Of course, it takes 2 to tango, and with the draft with less talent than a strip club at 2 p.m., it might be hard to find a trade partner in April. Should the Lions draft a quarterback this year or the next, the existing roster isn't as bare as their record might suggest. The Lions have a star in the making at running back, a security blanket at tight end, and a young brick wall at left tackle. They also have John Pinacini, and I just wanted to say John Pinacini. The point being, there are pieces in place. Certainly not all of them, but the team is underachieving. The Lions suck, and there is no doubt that they have sucked monumentally since the days of Bobby Lane, where they were champions of the NFL pre-Super Bowl. In this league, anyone can turn it around with the right coaching hire, a couple good drafts, and the right quarterback. Why are the Lions so bad? You just heard the long answer, but here's the short one. They're the Lions. Here's to hoping, though.
Inside. Here we go. Goff from the gun to the end zone. It is caught.